Yeah, so this talk is primarily based on the research that went into that book. Now, what I'm discussing is the nature of the ritual drink consumed by Zoroastrians in the ancient world and by Vedic Brahmans. Now, I'll explain what I mean. Now, the ancient religion of Persia is Zoroastrianism, the founder being Zoroaster, who may have lived in 1200 BC, but maybe 7 or 8 or even 600 BC. The contents of the holy books of the Zoroastrian religion, the Avesta, the ancient language of the oldest parts, are very similar to the language of the ancient text of the Brahmins, the Vedas. Now, these religions, that is Vedic, the Vedic religion of the Brahmins and the Zoroastrian religion, they have common origins. And those origins lie in what is now Turkmenistan. And I'm summarizing a lot of information here. That is just north of what is now Iran. Now, in 1600 BC, there was the eruption of the Santorini volcano. Now, that was an extraordinary event. It was the largest eruption on Earth since the last ice age. And just to summarize the influence or the effect of that eruption, the tsunami went twice around the world. The Aborigines in Alice Springs in Australia heard that explosion, and it's recorded in their tradition. The magma, or the ejector as it should be called, that came out of the volcano fell up to 200 miles either side of the eruption. The skies went black in China for 7 years. This is in 1600 BC. There was famine and failure of all 5 cereal crops under the Emperor Chu, and that's recorded in China. So for anybody living at that time, 1613 BC, it was the end of the world. Now, after that event, it's well known that there were large-scale migrations of people throughout Asia, and people who lived in Turkmenistan, who practiced a very ancient form of religion, they migrated first south into what is now Iran, and then some people went east, arriving in the Punjab area of India, which spans India and Pakistan, and others went west, arriving in what is now Athens in Greece. I'll come on to the Greek side of things at the end of this talk. But essentially, there's a common root for this practice. Now, these migrants into Iran and into India, they brought with them 2 central elements. Aha, there we go. Yeah, they brought with them 2 central elements. One is the worship of sacred fire, and the other is the consumption of a ritual drink known to the Vedic Indians as Soma and to the Zoroastrians as Hoama. It's the same thing. Yeah, there's just a linguistic thing with the change of the letters, the S and the H, but it's the same thing. We know from the texts from the Vedas, which are the most ancient religious texts of India, and from the Avesta, the ancient religious texts of the Zoroastrians, certain things about this ritual drink. It was consumed during rituals every few hours. It was very, very bitter. It was reddish, brownish, yellowish. Those are the colors that are used. It was made from bundles of stalks. Bundles of stalks were collected. In ancient India, the stalks were then bought from the man called the Soma seller, who had a very bad reputation, a bit like a sort of modern drug dealer. The deal was haggled, a goat or gold or various kinds of exchange in order to purchase these sticks. These sticks, these bundles of sticks, were then pounded in India on planks of wood with stones. In the Zoroastrian world, it's in mortar and pestle primarily. There's also traces of this practice of mortar and pestle used in ancient India. And here we have the slide showing Turkmenistan, just there, Turkmenistan, where the cult originated, essentially in this area. In the upper Oxus
Sorry,
region,
could I just interrupt, Matthew?
Yes.
tell us when you want to move on to the next slide. Bianca can click through them. So if you just say next slide.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So thanks very much for that. Yeah. So we have here the picture of Turkmenistan. There's the Amudarya or Oxus River running north through Turkmenistan, and it's from this area of the world that the cult almost certainly originated. So that's the sacred fire, worship of the sacred fire, and the ritual drink, this bitter drink. So next slide, please. Yeah. So then there's a migration into India, into this region here. This is the Punjab region, which I mentioned earlier. And then if we could go on to the next slide. Okay. Now, here we have a modern picture, obviously. This is Vedic Brahmans. These are the priestly caste of India. Here we have the fire. Here we have a typical Vedic ritual. Teams of priests reciting mantras, putting offerings into the fire of ghee, that's clarified butter, mustard seeds, and various other substances. Vedic Brahmins, who still exist, of course, in India, but of course they're not all of them practicing these religious rites like their ancestors used to. These Vedic Brahmins, they perform, if they're Orthodox, they perform these fire rituals in their own home. And then periodically, particularly on the new moon and the full moon, the ritual fires are taken outside to a high ground, and then these rituals are conducted around the fire. There are approximately 160 different kinds of Vedic ritual, the most important of which are the Soma rituals. This is the ritual where they drink the Soma. And the Soma rituals also are long events. They can last one day, they can last several days. In other words, repeated drinking of the sacred drink, the nectar of immortality. Now, there are descriptions in the texts, in the Avesta and in the Vedas, not that much, but there are descriptions of the effect of this concoction. And it includes visions of light, encounter with a near-death experience, shaking, a sense of enormous heat in the body. It was also for divinatory purposes, for healing. It was also used in some instances for battle. In other words, it was a very militant branch of the society also. It was inspirational. It provided poetic wisdom. Now, these rituals, these Soma rituals, and of course the other rituals, have been practiced by the Brahmins in India continuously, uninterrupted, since those early migrations to India in around 1600 BC. And it still continues to this day in remote corners of India. There are some places, some villages in India where they still perform these rituals identically, in exactly the same way as they would have performed these rituals 3,500 years ago. The mantras for these rituals are passed on typically from father to son. It's in Sanskrit. The mantras are in Sanskrit. The sons of the fathers have to learn these mantras very precisely. It's an enormous job memorizing the equivalent of a full-length book of text. They learn these mantras forwards, backwards, and inverting words and so on to make sure that the mantras are pronounced absolutely perfectly. If there's one syllable pronounced wrong during the ritual, it's cancelled by the officiating priests. There's an expiatory mantra, and then the whole thing is started again. So absolute correct pronunciation of mantras, long ritual sessions, and in the most important sessions, the drinking of this potion every 2 to 3 hours. The Soma juice, as I mentioned, was pressed with stones by these Vedic Indians, and also in mortar and pestle, but that's mostly in the Zoroastrian tradition. And here we have a picture of an altar. This picture I took in Badami, which is a place in Karnataka from the 7th century. And there you can see a hole in the middle of that stone there, where stalks would have been put and pressed, and the juices, expressed juices of those plants would have come out and been collected. They're mixed with water, first with water, especially collected water, and also with milk. The milk product, the fats in the milk products would have aided the absorption of any psychoactive molecules. So this is a very ancient practice. It's known also from the text that this concoction caused vomiting. This is something actually that's been missed by, I think, all other commentators on this. If you look carefully through the texts, there are many references to drinking the soma and vomiting. It's a purgative. So these rituals are obviously important. This substance, this soma substance, is obviously very, very important. It's central to their religious practice. And it's also very ancient. Now, it's also known that the Brahmins of India, for centuries, even though they perform these rituals, they use substitute plants. The most commonly used substitute plants these days, on the rare occasions when these rituals are performed, are vines which are non-psychoactive. In fact, there's one vine is called Sarcostema brevistigma, and the other is Periploca aphylla. Anyway, these are common vines in India. These vines are cut, collected, dried, and pressed. But of course, nothing happens when you drink a concoction of these vines mixed with water and milk. It's non-psychoactive. And the Brahmins know that they're using substitute plants, but they don't know what the original concoction was, what plants they were made from. Now, this is obviously a very central feature of ancient religion. And about 250 years ago, scholars first began investigating this, and numerous, dozens and dozens and dozens of theories in the last 250 years have been published on what scholars believe that sacred concoction was made of. Now, it has been pointed out by linguists also, and this is a very important point, that soma or homa derives from a particular root. In Sanskrit, it's su, or in Avestan, it's hu, it's the same thing. It doesn't refer to a particular plant. It means the expressed juice of plants or a plant. In other words, it has a meaning of, the meaning is referring to the expressed juice rather than the plant. And I believe that probably the most useful translation of soma would be something like psychedelic. But we're going on to the why it's psychedelic shortly. So, dozens of theories. The early commentators assumed it was some sort of beer or wine, or all sorts of ideas, because they didn't really know about psychoactive plants very much 250 years ago. An enormous effect on the research in this was the publication first in 1968 of Gordon Wasson's Soma, the Divine Mushroom of Immortality. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know what was coming. This is just, I'll go through this. This is just briefly, a picture of a Vedic ritual altar or arena. We have the various elements of this, including these, the places where the 3 fires were kept. This place called the Sadas is where the priests assemble. There's a place where an animal is tied to a post and sacrificed. These Vedic rituals were accompanied by the strangulation of an animal. That was also a feature of the very ancient practice of this religion, the animal sacrifice. So if we can go to the next picture, please. Yeah. Okay, and this is the equivalent in the Zoroastrian world. We see very similar elements. Here we have the fire and we have the priest who's conducting these rituals. And the next one, please. Yeah, and here we have a priest doing the fire rituals. You can see the stalks here, and one more picture, please. Yeah, next one. Okay, now, as I mentioned, there are many theories being published in the last 250 years about what this concoction might be. The leading theory currently, supported by the majority of scholars, is that they believe that soma or homa was from the plant Ephedra. And from ephedra, which we can see here is in stalks, we get ephedrine, which is a stimulant. Now, in the Zoroastrian world, this is the main belief is that it's ephedra, these stalks from this stimulant plant. Now, my argument against this is that, firstly, if you consume a stimulant repeatedly over a long period of time, the sorts of benefits you get from one shot, if you like, are not repeated when you keep doing stimulants. you end up with a hangover. It's a bit like drinking espresso. I mean, ephedra, the effect of ephedra is something like adrenaline or a strong coffee. And the as anybody will know, you get a good hit from a strong coffee, but if you keep drinking coffee, it gets rather unpleasant. And then, of course, if you're taking stimulants over a long period of time, there's going to be a hangover. But when we look in the texts, after these rituals, the priests and the participants do not seem to be hungover, they seem to be reborn. Now, this is the ephedra thesis, supported by, say, probably by the majority of scholars who looked into this. And these scholars, some of them do not accept that there's anything visionary or shamanic or psychedelic in the texts. I disagree with that. There are many other scholars who also disagree with that. And as I mentioned, if you look in the text, you have these descriptions of seeing light, of near-death experiences, of flying through the air, and so on. It does not look like an ordinary stimulant to me. And further, in all the cultures that use ephedra, either for medicine or for stimulant, their stimulant effect, there's nothing like reverence for the plant. It's just used as a stimulant. It's called ma huang in China, has many therapeutic uses, but as I say, there's no reverence for it. It's just a common stimulant. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. I think we're going to see some more pictures of ephedra. There we are. One more ephedra. This is the ephedra plant. Yeah. And there we have one more picture of the ephedra. Great. And then stop there. We go on to that's it. We'll stop there. This is the fly agaric. So ephedra is the leading contender in terms of theory. But as I mentioned earlier, in 1968, Gordon Wasson, the great founder of one of the great founders of ethnomycology, he published the book Soma, the Divine Mushroom of Immortality, in which he proposed the fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria. Now, he's widely credited with being the first person to introduce the idea that Soma was psychedelic. And nobody had really considered that before 1968. Well, they might have considered it, but there was nothing published on this. Now, the fly agaric mushroom is, of course, used by shamans in Siberia. It's also used in Afghanistan. It's also used in North America by particular North American indigenous tribes. But as I mentioned, when we look in the Vedas, we look in the Avesta, we're talking about plants that are looking like stalks and need mortar and pestle or stones to pound them to get the juice out. Now, this seems to me a very strong objection against the plant being fly agaric. There are other reservations about this too, particularly that in the Brahmanical world, the Brahmins are very, very particular about their food and their intake. They only eat food from Brahmin households. They only drink water, if they're orthodox, of course, from their own well. And there are very strict prohibitions on certain kinds of foods, and one of them is mushrooms. Mushrooms are forbidden for Brahmins. And this goes way back to the early centuries BC in these texts called law texts, these Dharma Shastra texts, where it's said that Brahmins should not eat mushrooms. So that's another objection. The third objection to the Amanita muscaria thesis is that for most people, the effect of untreated Amanita is actually quite unpleasant. You get stomach cramps, you get blurred vision, and the effects are not that pleasant. Now, there are reports of very extraordinary experiences with fly agaric. There's also information available about how if you dry the Amanita, you also can eliminate quite a few of the toxins. But I think the overall picture is probably that the overall picture leads me to think that it almost certainly wasn't fly agaric. Now, one of the elements of this story that I've been writing about recently is the importance in traditional societies of multiple plant concoctions. Now, in traditional medicine, in Ayurveda, which is the traditional medicine of India, if you look through the classical texts, the foundational texts of Ayurveda, that is by Sushrut and Charak and Bhagbat. Those texts date between the beginning of the Common Era, that's Sushrut and Charak, And if we go to the 6th century, when we have Vogbut, who synthesizes those earlier texts, if we look through those texts, we see that in most cases, when plant medicines are prescribed, they're in multiple plant formulas. 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 different kinds of plants mixed together. It's the synergetic effect of lots of plants mixed together, which is the sort of default position in tribal medicine. Whether you're looking in Africa or South America, we have this same understanding of multiple plant formulas. Interestingly, when there was research going on into, this is going back about 100 years, into the curare, the poison used by some South American tribes in their darts, it was assumed by the early researchers that there was one vine that was responsible. Later research substantiated the idea that in fact it's multiple plant formulas. And so this is quite a lengthy topic just in itself, but I think what we have to do is look for multiple plant formulas. Another element of this story is that if we look in the Materia Medica of India, which is the plants used for medical purposes in ancient India and in modern India, we will notice that there are about 20 plants referred to as Soma. Now, why is it that 20 or so plants are called Soma? Also, scholars have been puzzled by references in the Avesta to there being many Homas. And now they couldn't understand this. Why are there many Homas? Also, if you look through the Vedas, we find the Soma of the mountains, the Soma of the valleys, the Soma of the rivers, lots of different kinds of Soma. And this aspect of it is important because what is actually in plain sight in the text is that Soma, as I mentioned earlier, is the expressed juice of plants, but it's not just one plant, it's multiple plant formulas. Now, I mentioned Ephedra as one of the plants that was the main plant that's supported by many scholars who don't believe there's anything psychedelic in the Vedas or in the Avesta. Then there's the fly agaric thesis, which is to date the only psychedelic plant that's been put forward as possibly being Soma. And there's also another plant that's supported by some scholars. This is Syrian rue, Peganum harmala. This plant is called Isfand, Stipund. It's got many names. It has angular brown seeds. Maybe we can see the next slide to look at the seeds. Yeah, one more picture. Oh, there's the flower. Okay, one more. There's the seeds. Okay, now these seeds here, these are the seeds of the Syrian rue plant. These are used in folk medicine in many places in Asia. They contain harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine. And the significance of these chemicals is that they are distinctly psychoactive. They are used. These seeds are used in aphrodisiac potions, and for generally getting high in Asia. Now, the effect of harmine and harmaline and tetrahydroharmine, the effect of these chemicals has been described as oneirophrenic, dream-inducing. Claudio Naranjo did some pioneering work in the 60s on the effect of these drugs, and it leads to an introverted kind of state, a dream kind of state. He used it for psychotherapy, accessing unconscious material and so on. But on their own, they are not what might be called psychedelic. Now, it's certainly true that if you take high doses of any drug, you can end up with hallucinations and various kinds of extreme experiences. But once you get over a certain dose level with Syrian rue, again, it becomes extremely unpleasant. And the point where it becomes psychedelic, it becomes also extremely unpleasant. Now, the significance of Syrian rue is that tetrahydroharmine and harmaline, these are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And this also is important because my proposition in the book is that what was going on in the ancient world was that they were making analogues of ayahuasca. Now, these days, a few years ago, I had to explain what ayahuasca was. I think most people, especially in your Psychedelic Society, have probably got an idea of what ayahuasca is. And just in case, in South America, particularly in the Amazon region, there are various tribes, mestizo tribes, that make and consume ayahuasca. It's a powerful psychedelic drink. The main active psychoactive molecule is DMT, dimethyltryptamine. But if you consume a plant containing DMT, enzymes in the gut break it down and you get no experience at all. However, if you consume a DMT containing plant alongside a plant that contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, then the DMT, you get a DMT, the DMT enters into your bloodstream, and hence you get the effect of the DMT. After about 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours, the mechanisms of the body kick in and the DMT gets broken down, and it no longer has an effect. So you drink another potion. Now, interestingly, there are now known to be about 80 odd plants that contain DMT and another 80 odd plants that contain monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And this means that there are numerous ways you can make an ayahuasca analog concoction, but using different plants from the plants they use in South America. It's also worth bearing in mind that in South America, when they make ayahuasca, the norm is to mix not only the plant with the DMT, which is chacruna, it's a plant with a leaf, chacruna or chacrona, which is mixed with the Banisteriopsis carpi vine, which contains the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. No, that's the two central plants, but also there are numerous additive plants used in different places and by different tribes in different situations as multiple plant formulas. That's the norm for producing ayahuasca concoctions in South America. Now, when you know that there are numerous plants that contain DMT and numerous plants that contain monoamine oxidase inhibitors, it means you can make an ayahuasca analog or an ayahuasca concoction anywhere, if you know enough about plants. In fact, the first time I drank what was called ayahuasca, that was 23 years ago in Amsterdam, what we consumed was a mixture of Syrian rue and Mimosa hostilis. Now, Mimosa hostilis contains DMT and the Syrian rue. There's the Mimosa hostilis tree. Thank you very much. So Mimosa hostilis, the bark of that, you can extract DMT, and mixed with the Syrian rue, you get an ayahuasca experience. So I say my first experience is what was called ayahuasca. Wasn't actually the plants that they use in South America. It was plants that were collected in other places. But it has a very similar effect to ayahuasca because essentially you're still getting the DMT in the brain. So this is how these plants can be used. Now, interestingly, when you start looking at the materia medica of India and you look at the plants called Soma, you can notice that quite a few of them are either plants containing monoamine oxidase inhibitors or plants containing DMT. This is the clue, really, to how they were making these concoctions in the ancient world. Also, looking through the Vedas and the ancillary Brahmanas, there are several plants mentioned that are very important. Obviously, they're called Soma. They're extolled in the same way as givers of freedom and immortality, and so on and so on. There's a lot of work that needs to be done because translations are very difficult. You've got names in Sanskrit in these texts, but what exactly these names are referring to, which plants and which species of plants, is sometimes very difficult to determine. But there are enough clues to make some progress in this way. Now, if we move on one more slide, there's Mimosa hostilis again. Sorry, there's the Mimosa hostilis. Yeah, that's thank you very much. And now, okay, stop there. Interestingly, also, when we look in the Vedas, we see that a species of grass called Kusa or darbha grass is absolutely everywhere. One of the great scholars of the Veda, Hung Honda, a Dutch scholar, he said that if you look through the text, Kush or darbha grass is mentioned to excess. It's everywhere. It's used throughout rituals. Every kind of Brahmanical ritual uses Kush grass. Now, why is this ordinary grass, which grows everywhere? You can pick it in a park in Delhi, you can find it on beaches in Goa, it grows all over India. What is the significance of this? The significance is that, here we have another examples. This is used for rituals. Here is sticks of darbha grass. You can see these bundles of stalks used for Brahmanical rituals. Yeah, if we can go on one more slide. Let's look at one more. Oh, we will stop there. That's okay. So Kush grass, very important. The significance is of the Kush grass is that, or darbha grass, it's the same thing, is that it's a relative of phalaris grass, and phalaris grass, some species of phalaris grass are rich in DMT. There was a publication in the 1990s by Jim DeCorn, which said, or the chapter in his book, which says you can make ayahuasca from your lawn clippings. It's a bit flippant. It's not that simple. You have to know what you're doing. But Giorgio Samorini, an expert on psychoactive plants from Italy, he's done tests on numerous species of Kush grass or darbha grass growing in Italy, and also found that some varieties contain no DMT, some varieties contain a lot. Some if you test plants in different times of the year or different times of day, you will find very little DMT or a lot of DMT, depending on the season and the time of day. But it's certainly the case that in Kush grass, darbha grass, which is a relative of phalaris grass, you find DMT in some species. So I believe that Kush grass, darbha grass was also one of the additive plants used for the concoctions. Now, I also speculate that some of the holy trees of India, which have never properly been tested for psychoactive properties, such as the Banyan tree, that's the Banyan tree, the Neogroda, the downward growing tree. I suspect that this may have psychoactive properties, but as I say, this has never been tested properly. There's another tree, the Peepal tree. There's a Peepal tree. These are the holy trees of India, and similarly, no proper tests of this have been done for psychoactive properties. Now, interestingly, there is actually serotonin in the Peepal tree. I'm not sure if it's in the leaves or the bark, but that's been discovered. Serotonin, and serotonin, as we know, in molecular terms, it's very similar to tryptamines, the active molecules in DMT, LSD, and magic mushrooms. So these are possible sources of further investigation. So we can move on to one more tree. Now here's another tree that I found interesting. This is the flame of the forest, called Parna in Sanskrit. A flame of the forest, Bhutia frondosa. This is revered in the highest terms. This is the Parna tree. And also equated with Soma. There's a myth how the eagle went to heaven and from the sun took the Soma juice back to earth, and also the drops became the flame of the forest, the Parna tree. Again, no proper tests have been done on these trees for psychoactive properties. So one more slide, maybe. Now here's another one, Ficus glomerata another fig tree. Yeah, here we have another example of this. Now, just if we go on to Gesmodium gangeticum. Now, this is a very interesting plant. This is one of the plants called Soma in the Materia Medica of India. And the great chemist Alexander Shulgin, he did tests on this plant. It's called Soma, it's revered. The roots of this plant contain, in Shulgin's word, a whopping 25% DMT. So this plant is actually saturated with DMT. Yeah, this is and it's a common plant. Yeah, this is one you can find very easily in India. There's a species of this. Oh, sorry. Before we get to that, one more. We can go to the next slide, please. That's the Arundadonax. So this is giant reed, and the This reed is very common. You can find this growing in Europe, all over Europe, also in India. The species of this Arundodonax has been tested in India, and the species growing in India has the highest DMT content of all the Arundodonax species tested. Arundodonax, my original speculation that it was one of the additive plants. I have been advised that there are also toxins in this plant which might make it less reliable as a provider of DMT. But it is a plant which contains DMT in significant amounts in some of the varieties. So these are just this is just a very, very fast run over, a survey of some of these. Now this plant, Phylodium pulchellum or Desmodium pulchellum, there's a researcher in Australia, and he's been researching this. And interestingly, this plant, the Phylodium pulchellum, contains both MAOIs and DMT. And this researcher in Australia, Julian Palmer, who's written a very interesting book called Articulations, he's found that this works as just on its own, brewed as a tea, works on its own as an ayahuasca-like plant. I'm at the moment uncertain whether this Phylodium pulchellum is in fact in a different family or is a different species from the Desmodium gangeticum, which we saw earlier. In some plant dictionaries or databases, the two plants are identified as the same plant. So Julian Palmer thinks it's a different plant. It's open to speculation. But anyway, were they using this plant in ancient India, or were they using the other one, which is in the same family, but just a slightly different species? But whichever way, this plant contains both MAOIs and DMT. It's also a purgative. So we have a plant that's like, if you like, a ready-made ayahuasca plant. So yeah, if we can move on, we'll have a look at one more picture. Okay, now this is the hypothesis that I'm presenting, essentially, that in the ancient world, they were making these analogues of ayahuasca from many different kinds of plants. If we take this as the working hypothesis, it also solves numerous puzzles that scholars have had over the last 250 years. It explains why many plants are referred to as Soma in the Avesta and in the Vedas. It also explains references in the Vedas about mixing the leaves of one plant with the stalks of another plant. It also explains the purgative nature of the concoction, because as we know, ayahuasca is also a purgative. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that there was the eruption of the Santorini volcano, large-scale migrations of people throughout Asia, and also in 1600 BC. As you can see on this map, there's Athens in the sort of center right, and then 22 kilometers away, going left, we have the Temple of Eleusis, founded in 1600 BC. At the same time as this volcano erupted. And this temple at Eleusis, if we can go on to the next picture, there we have a picture of the sanctuary, a reconstruction of the architecture of that sanctuary. Now, similarly to the ancient Greek, the ancient Persian and ancient Indian world, there was a sacred concoction drunk at the mystery rites conducted in Eleusis. Eleusis was the main sanctuary for initiation into the mysteries of the ancient world. Here's a reconstruction of the temple site. The ritual used to be conducted, the initiation ritual at Eleusis was conducted every year in September. The entire ritual lasted about 9 days. It included fasting and sacrifice of a pig, a procession along the ancient way to Eleusis, along the ritual road. And then in total secrecy, over the course of 2 nights, the participants used to drink this bitter potion in small cups. It all sounds a bit familiar, I guess. Again, it was a near-death experience. The people used to shout and shake and have visions. It was absolutely illegal in the ancient world, in the ancient Greco-Roman world, to talk about what happened during the mystery rites. In fact, it was a death penalty for discussing it. It was that serious. You could not discuss what happened during the mystery rites. But from traces left in classical literature, scholars have been able to piece together the ritual. But they don't exactly know what they were drinking. The current, there's only really been one psychedelic proposition. Again, there's the mushroom proposition. Amanita muscaria or psilocybin mushrooms have been proposed by various scholars. But the best known theory of what this potion was published in a book called The Road to Eleusis by Carl Ruck, Albert Hoffman, who invented LSD, and Gordon Wasson, the great mycologist. And this proposition in that book, Road to Eleusis, published in 1978, was that they were using the ergot fungus in order to produce a psychedelic concoction. There's a whole chapter on the, my book, there's a whole chapter just on the ergot fungus hypothesis. Essentially, I think that ergot was too toxic. Even if it was sufficiently processed, you'd still be only extracting lysergic acid amide, which is visionary. It was used in the ancient world in South America and so on, but I don't think it was, I think it was almost certainly not the substance they were using. I believe that also in the ancient Greco-Roman world, they were using ayahuasca analogues. In other words, they had enough knowledge of plants to produce their own kind of ayahuasca, which is called in Greek, the clue is there, kykeon, which means mixed potion. Interestingly, once you pass through the great mysteries, here we have a picture of a modern ayahuasca preparation coming up towards the end of the story, as it were. This is in South America, and we can see these stalks. These are being crushed as they would have been in the ancient Vedic world, ancient Zoroastrian world, crushed stalks of the vine, of the Banisteriopsis carpi vine. In ancient Greece, if you pass through the mysteries, only then were you allowed to become a citizen of the society and to cast your vote. In other words, no ayahuasca, no vote. It would be, I think, a rather interesting election in the USA if such a condition was stipulated for the voters in the current election. Yeah, we might get quite a different kind of result. So this is what they were up to in the ancient world, in ancient Greece. There were many mystery cults in the ancient Greco-Roman world, but they were all primarily based on the mystery rites of Eleusis, where you, after the passage through this ordeal, you would say you became a citizen and you saw. These rites continued uninterrupted from 1600 BC until the 4th century, when the Catholic Emperor Theodosius forbade the mystery rite, any kind of mystery rite, and there were many people executed for still continuing to practice the mystery religions. That went completely underground, and of course was replaced by Catholic Christianity, who did not approve of these kinds of psychedelic initiations. So my clue for all this really was ayahuasca, because we see such distinct parallels between the way ayahuasca is prepared in South America, the way it seems the sacred potions were prepared in ancient Asia and in ancient Iran, the reverence for the plants, the multiple different varieties of uses of these plants are put to. In South America, the ayahuasca is used also not just for healing and for visionary purposes, but also by some tribes for warfare. Some tribes, they use it for sorcery. And it was a similar in ancient Asia. In the Vedas, there are also in the Samveda, there are prescriptions for using ayahuasca for sorcery and also black magic, and also for warfare in certain situations. But it was this potion that was central, I believe, to the formulation of ancient understandings of the cosmos. I also believe that humans' experiments with psychedelic psychoactive plants probably led in India to the development of yogic practice, which is at its root meditation and breathing exercises. And I think that through yogic practice, they were able, and people still are able to attain non-ordinary states of consciousness without the use of plants. Very similarly, when Stan Grof was doing his LSD therapy up until 1972 in the USA, when he was prevented from using LSD as a psychotherapeutic tool, he developed holotropic breathing, again, to induce non-ordinary states of consciousness through breathing. And I think that's what probably happened in ancient India, that in other words, the concoction came first and the yogic practice followed as a result of initiation into the mysteries of the divine cosmos, induced through these rituals. So the clues are all there in the texts. I cannot prove this, but if you look at the cumulative evidence, it seems to me almost certain that that was probably what was going on in the ancient world, both in Greece and in Persia and in India. So the interesting thing also about these concoctions is that if we look at the names for the concoctions in India, one of the main names for Soma is Amrita. Amrita means non-death. It also got transformed into the idea of an internal nectar, if you like, internal Soma in the brain. So Amrita in Sanskrit, non-death. In other words, immortality. In Greek, we have nectar, which means keeping death afar. We have ambrosia, or ambrotos, again, non-death. And I think the reason that this concoction was referred to in this way is because if you enter into a deep, non-ordinary state of consciousness, it is timeless. You are, in some sense, immortal, because immortality is dependent on time. If you enter in a timeless, non-ordinary state of consciousness, you are in that deathless realm, the realm of light, the realm of the gods, the realm of this transcendent thing. And this is this I think is the root of ancient Greek and Indian and Persian religion. And the last slide shows just how far we've come from this understanding of this concoction. So the very last picture should illustrate this. Last slide. There we go. Ambrosia. So we've come a long way from understanding understanding the essential root of ambrosia, ambrotos, non-death. Yeah. So, well, thank you. I've been talking for about an hour now, and so if anybody has any questions, just don't be shy.
Thank you, Matthew. Right, so I do think we have received a few questions already here. I'm going to start. Bianca, you want to take this?
Well, okay, so we've had a few things in the chat box from Sumit.
Yeah.
Sumit, do you want to ask a question, or I guess I can just read this off. He says, if I'm not mistaken, this is the same concoction as Soma Ras, the drink of the demigods.
That's right. Yes, Soma Ras, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and he says, the true meaning of yoga is the way of life, a way to merge to the higher self, done through the 8 stages of yoga.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sumit, if you wanna, I'm not sure if you're asking a question here, but if you are looking to deepen the discussion on this particular topic, perhaps you could unmute to have a discussion with Matthew directly.
In the meantime, I have a question, Matthew.
Yes.
Okay, so the other day, one of my friends told me a theory that he'd heard, that the ergot fungus played a role in the Salem witch trials. In particular, that the wheat that was making the bread that the people in Salem were eating had ergot fungus in it. Have you heard this? And what do you think about that?
Yes. Well, it's well known that ergot fungus is extremely toxic and actually very dangerous. It's a vasoconstrictor. You get gangrene, and if you consume raw ergot fungus, you can very easily die. There have been many outbreaks of what used to be called St. Anthony's fire. It's the the illness that follows the consumption of ergot from eating bread that has been made from rye with the ergot fungus attached. So ergot is in fact one of the main routes for making LSD. From out of ergot you extract a lysergic acid amide, and then you turn it into dimethyl amide. But of course it's purified and cleaned with other chemicals so that the toxins are taken out. Now, referring to the witches Salem and so on, witches in the medieval period are known to have consumed psychoactive concoctions, particularly with scopolamine-containing drugs such as henbane, belladonna, and datura. And also, it's possible that they, and I don't know directly about the use of ergot consciously, but if you eat bread that has been contaminated with ergot, then you're very open to having a psychedelic experience that is extraordinarily unpleasant, and you could even die of it. There have been outbreaks of ergotism or St. Anthony's fire periodically throughout history. In the last famous case was in France in the 1940s. Another big outbreak of it in Russia in the 1920s, and so it's a well-known phenomenon that the ergot fungus, untreated, is extremely toxic. Yeah, but as I say,
Yeah, no, thanks. That's really cool. It puts a whole new spin on the Salem witch trials, doesn't it?
Yes.
Does anybody else have any questions? Now's the time to pipe in.
I have a question. So this whole ritual and the identity of the plant became lost to time, essentially. How is it that the knowledge was lost, or when exactly did this happen, and how is it that they lost track of what they were using?
That's a very good question, and I don't have any very good answer for that. I have discovered that there's a living ayahuasca tradition, so when I say ayahuasca analog tradition, in northern Iran. That's run by Kalandar Sufis, who are the most radical of all Sufis. They are extremely outside the law and very, very radical people. I've actually written on the Kalandar Sufis, but I discovered a few years ago that there's a living cult of it in northern Iran. The Iranian in Iran, the Zoroastrians were displaced by the Muslims from the 6th, 7th century onwards, and then they came to India, where they're known as the Parsis, and they, up until recently, were using the Ephedra plant for their rituals. But of course, Ephedra is not psychedelic. They sort of lost that. I also thought that the whole cult had disappeared from India completely. They lost the knowledge of the plants, but I've discovered very recently that in fact there's a living ayahuasca tradition also in Bengal. And I'm just at the moment pursuing the active ingredients of that potion, run by a small group of tantrikas, these tantric people in Bengal. So it still exists, but in a very, very small way, and of course hardly known about. I only discovered this stuff in Bengal this year, actually. So that was through a friend who actually was in Bengal and discovered that they were making ayahuasca. When I say ayahuasca, they were making Soma from a variety of psychoactive plants. And I'm just hoping to get soon the list of plants that they were using. I'm very, very curious to see what they're up to. But the mainstream Brahmins, they lost the knowledge of the plants. The latest reference I've got in any text is from the Bauer manuscript. That's the 6th century, where there are formulas printed or published in that text. It's the oldest surviving Indian medical text. Then in that text, they list multiple plant formulas for making amrit or soma. And the two formulas in that text comprise together about 100 plants. So like many plants mixed together to make the psychedelic concoction. Now, why it disappeared, this is very, very difficult to know why it disappeared from mainstream India. Yeah. And I have no good answer. Yes. Yeah.
That was a good answer, at least for me. Okay, anybody else? Questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I know that in the Amazonian ayahuasca tradition, because it seems quite unlikely that they would know to combine two plants that are rich in DMT and MAOI, and the belief is that the spirit of these plants led them to them, and
exactly,
taught
yes.
them how to come. So I'm just wondering now, knowing that this exists in other traditions, not just limited to the Amazonian one, is there any reference in the texts to how they knew to combine these two types of plants?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think, again, there are these myths. I mentioned one of them about the Soma being brought to earth by the eagle from the sun. They have various mythological explanations of how humans discovered this formula. But I think it's most probable that this was an accident, in the same way that there's a mythological explanation, like in South America, as you mentioned, you know, the spirit of the plants leading the shamans directly to the plants and so on. That's the way they explain it. But in practical terms, I think it's just a question of trial and error. If we look at the long span of human history over the last 100,000 years or so, it just takes one person to consume those two plants together, maybe for purgative purposes, because purgation is a big factor in medicine, both in India and in traditional medicine in South America. In other words, purgation, using plants for purgative purposes, is part of the medical tradition. And you only have to, by accident, consume two purgative plants at the same time, or you'll consume one and then you consume another, and then something happens, and then, oh my goodness, what was that about? And so, you know, it just takes maybe one person or a group of people to make this discovery, and then once it's been discovered, that's it. And I think similarly, in the way that it was discovered in South America, these same kind of discoveries happened in ancient Turkmenistan 4,000, 5,000 years ago. Who knows how long ago? But yeah, similar kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Thank you. And it's also really interesting that, I mean, in the Amazonian, I guess it's not as common to find like chacruna, but in the Indian tradition, or the Indian, ancient Indian tradition, it's amazing that these plants are so common. You can just find them on the side of the road, both.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, yes. And also, as I mentioned before, when we look at traditional use of ayahuasca, there are some tribes that just use the kapi vine, you know, just crushed on its own, like cold pressed. But the most common thing is to actually mix many plants, 30, 40 additive plants, up to 30, 40 additive plants in the ayahuasca brew to enhance it in different ways. So they see it as a multiple plant formula, which varies from tribe to tribe, from area to area, from season to season. And I think it was the same in ancient Asia. They just knew enough about plants to make these very powerful concoctions. But the main thing, I believe, is that they're somehow getting DMT into your system, because that is that particular class of tryptamines. It's the ones that are so close, DMT and psilocybin and LSD. Those molecules are very similar, and they have the unique capacity not just to induce altered states of consciousness, but to allow entry into a profound trance state, like the mystical trance experience. And I think that's the root of the whole thing. Somehow getting DMT into your system through these psychoactive concoctions.
Cool. That's very cool. Thanks. Fantastic talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Could I ask a question as well?
Of course.
Okay. So you were showing us examples of a lot of plants which are in India. So what is about an India and Amazonia? So what is it about this climate that makes those plants grow there? That because I assume that there are more of them there than here in Europe, because you just kind of or maybe you focused on this area. That's actually my question. Is there a lot of psychedelic containing plants in Europe as well, or is it mostly there, or didn't we just discover them, or how does it work?
Psychoactive plants are actually everywhere. And you have also in Europe, you have plants that we use. I mentioned there's a short discussion of witches earlier. And there are plants such as henbane, belladonna, deadly nightshade, mandrake, datura, and these plants were used in shamanic, witches use these plants in a shamanic way in Europe. And also there are, as I say, many plants growing in Europe that contain DMT, and there are also MAOI plants. So if you know enough about plants, you can actually make ayahuasca analogs anywhere. It's just a question of knowing enough about plants and which ones to use.
All right, thank you. That's very interesting.
Anybody else got a question?
Just have to ask, how much would you say that these practices affected the current state of like Hinduism today?
Well, I think the significance of these experiences, now this is highly speculative, I mean, and there are also a lot of factors. There's not just one factor in all this, but I think one aspect of this whole project is that, first of all, we need to consider ancient Greece and ancient India as within one cultural region. If we look at mythology, we look at languages, if we look at the development of philosophy, we see exact parallels between those two cultures. And when we look at ancient Greece, we look at ancient India and the development of philosophy, the development of thinking, we can see something very distinctive that happened there in terms of human mental activity. And I think that this probably led to the development of philosophy, which in one way can be characterized as the investigation into reality, the difference between the appearance of something and the reality behind it. I mean, this is a whole big topic in itself, the gradual development of philosophy. But I think over many years, many centuries of using these concoctions, humans started to think differently about things. And that led to the development of philosophy in this ancient cultural zone. Now, as regarding the effect of on Hinduism, if we think of the ancient world where people were regularly exposed to these non-ordinary states of consciousness originally through psychoactive plants and then through yogic practice, then Hinduism and Buddhism both have this background of radically non-altered states. And I think that is very important. It's a very distinctive thing. And in India, philosophy is practiced not in an abstract way traditionally, but as a tool for liberation. It's the way you think about things that leads to a liberated state. So I think that in the background, if we consider the use of these plants, psychoactive concoctions over many centuries, it explains why, particularly in ancient India, we have such an enormous flourishing of philosophical ideas and insight into the nature of reality.
Thank you.
I think we'll have time for one more question if anybody has any.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes,
this is Nenko from Bulgaria. Thank you to Cambridge Psychedelic Society for organizing this. Thank you to Mr. Matthew Clark. I'd like to ask, since I've read some studies on the topics, have you heard of other psychedelics such as the active ingredients in cannabis metabolizing into DMT? Because I've noticed the chemical compounds are quite similar, just like with different details on them, like the sides of the chains. Have you heard of, as I mentioned, like cannabinoids metabolizing into DMT or other studies of the matter?
I haven't come across that before, and I don't believe that actually happens. The molecular structures within cannabis are really quite distinct from those in what you might call the tryptamine family. There's the cannabinoids. You've got about eight different cannabinoids. You've got several tetrahydra cannabinoids, at least 2 of those. And they all have distinct effect on the endocannabinoid system within the body. But DMT is a separate thing. Though tryptamines are a separate class of molecules to the class of molecules you find in cannabis, and I don't think it's possible that cannabis can mutate into DMT. That's my own take on it. I might be wrong, but I don't think it's.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. That was excellent. I learned a lot.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'll just say, if anybody's interested in my book, people have been finding it difficult to get hold of, but it's published these days by Eon Books. That's AEON Books, Eon Books. So if you can't find it on Amazon, just go to Eon Books, and then you'll find it there. If you like to look in there's there's so much. There's a lot of stuff in the book I haven't been able to talk about tonight, but it's all in there. All the stuff I've talked about tonight as well.
Great, Matthew. Thank you. And if you want to post in the chat other links where we can find more of your content, for example, please feel free to do that.
Okay, I'll do that. Yeah.
Thanks again.
It's worth noting that the link to buy Matthew's book is in the event description, both on Facebook and on the Chem Talks website.
There you go. Perfect.